us. Art, thank you so much for being here. I'm very excited, and there's been a lot of chatter and excitement about your joining us. So we're really thrilled to have you here. The way that this works, Art, I'm not sure if you see it in any episodes, but I always start with the first three same questions for everybody. And then we're going to end with the same questions. And in between, we're going to talk about complex planning and examining alternatives. Thanks so much for being here.
Oh, it's great to be here, Emil.
So let's get started. The first question is, in 2 minutes or less, tell us your professional story. How did you professionally get to where you are today?
I'll do my best to jam this into 2 minutes, but basically, okay. I fell in love with the field of cognitive science as an undergraduate at Brown, and thought, wow, it'd be really cool to be a professor someday. So applied to some graduate programs, got into one at the University of Illinois, did my graduate work there. Was lucky enough to get a visiting faculty job at Northwestern, and then worked for 5 years as an assistant professor at Columbia University, and then came to the University of Texas in 1998. And, the first half of my career was a pretty traditional academic career. I wrote lots of papers that get read by 30 of my closest colleagues. I taught classes. I had, trained graduate students and things like that. But along the way, I began to think a little bit about what was it that I could do that if I didn't do it, wouldn't get done. And one of the things had to do with really trying to bring more of my field outward so that people understood why psychology is important, not just because of the research we do, but because of the way that it can influence people's lives. And that led me to start blogging and doing other kinds of writing. As I like to say, there are people in this world who won't listen to what you have to say unless they're paying for the information. So I started doing a little bit of consulting, and that because we always report the work that we do as faculty, it meant the dean's office knew what I was doing. And so when they started thinking about creating an outward-facing master's program in the College of Liberal Arts, they asked me if I would help get that off the ground. So I became the founding director of the Human Dimensions of Organizations program, and found I really enjoyed this kind of entrepreneurial creation of new things and building things up. And so I did that for 8 years, and then an opportunity came to work to change the direction a little bit of what was going on at the IC² Institute. So we shifted the focus there to take a really human-centered approach to thinking about economic development in small communities. And then to round this out for today, I guess I'll say that in April, I learned the valuable lesson that when the provost of the university texts you at 5 o'clock on a Saturday and says, "Can we talk?" that your life isn't about to get easier. And that's how I ended up as the head of the academic working group for planning for COVID.
Yeah, super exciting. We'll talk more about that. And that's what I love about what you do is you take academic research and you figure out how to apply it to the real world. And you use the term human-centered, and I love it. And I know a lot of other people are so excited about the kind of work that you do. So what do you suspect or know bothers people about you as a leader? Or, and this is not the same question, but you can choose to answer this one. What is your leadership weakness?
So I think the thing that probably bothers people most is that I tend to get an idea that I'm pretty sure is going to work, and so I'll just come out and say I think we can do this, and then I put my team in a position of then having to say, I guess we're doing that, and how are we going to do that? And so I feel like I create a certain amount of chaos that forces a lot of people to walk behind me and clean it up. And I think that it's a I think that's probably the biggest source of tension that I create.
Yeah. You might not be surprised to know that this is a recurring theme on this episode, on this this program. So last lead, it's sort of standard question. What does leadership mean to you?
Leadership is a lot of things. I think the danger with talking about leadership is that we often confuse it with a position on the org chart. And
Right.
leadership fundamentally is about doing things that have a positive influence on the people around us to be to be better as individuals and better as an organization. And that manifests itself in lots of different ways, depending on where you are in the org chart, depending on what your responsibilities are. But all of us have responsibilities both to lead and to follow. You can't be part of an organization if you do not, if you're not also fundamentally part of the organization. And if the situation requires it, you're pulling a wheelbarrow or setting up chairs or whatever it is. And if the situation requires it, you're setting vision for things. But you have to be able to be both a leader and a follower in order to be effective at either of those roles.
Okay, let's get into some of your personal aspect of your life. And I think it may be a big personal aspect of your life. You're a musician, because I've heard you talk about it in different contexts. Talk to us about how music plays into your life and how it affects your life, in particular, maybe how it affects your professional life and the research that you do.
Yeah, it's funny. I played the piano as a kid. And I was forced to take lessons. I think my parents might be listening today, so they can hear me say that. But I'm glad that they did, because that was wonderful. But as an adult, I was in my mid-30s, and I realized, I always wished I'd learned to play the saxophone. And so I actually took up sax lessons, which was great, because in the future, after now, almost 20 years of doing this, people will say, you learned that as an adult. And it's sometimes a revelation that actually you're allowed to keep learning stuff. And actually it was really wonderful too, to do that at a stage of my life where I'd had some success professionally, and suddenly I was doing something I was really terrible at, because it reminds you how domain specific everything is. Just because you're good at one thing doesn't mean that you're automatically good at everything. And I think that was a valuable lesson. But I also found, it's funny, I do various talks about leadership and things like that. And I actually have one that I do about the influence of jazz on being a leader. And two of the things that come out of that I'll share, one of which is, when you read books on jazz improvisation, they say that when you sit in with a new group of musicians, it's really important that you listen more than you play. And I think that's extraordinarily important, particularly if you take on a new role, or if you're working with a new group of people, that you actually have to hear where they are, what their concerns are, and to fit yourself into the style of what's going on, rather than assuming that you're going to shape everything, to bend everything to your will. And I think that's right. that I love that. And I think the other thing that's really important to bear in mind is that you're going to make mistakes in every role in your life. And I remember my saxophone teacher, I would blow a particularly sour note in a lesson, and I'd stop and I'd scowl, and he'd put his hand up to his ear and he'd go, "It's gone." Right? I mean, right. There's nothing you can do about the note you played already. So do something about the next note. Learn from it if you have to, or weave it into whatever you were doing. But don't allow yourself to be so captivated by the things that went wrong that you don't find a way to move forward. And I've carried that lesson with me as well. So there's a lot of ways in which it's enriched my life. And the thing I miss with COVID is I play in a ska band called Phineas Gage, and right. I'm part of the horn section, and we haven't been able to play together in over a year. And I miss the guys in the band, and I miss just playing music for people. So I'm looking forward to getting back to that when the pandemic lifts.
That's great. I mean, that's, before we came on, we were talking about this, that, sometimes you have to admit that you're going to have to stumble through these things. And that's what, learning doesn't stop when you're a kid. When you're an adult, if you're going to get moving, you're going to have to admit to yourself that I'm going to, out of the gates, I'm going to be stumbling a lot. And something like music, like it's infinite, like you're always going to be learning. And
there's always somebody better. And there's all, you have to, sometimes there's a certain number of things you have to do just because it feeds you, and to stop doing social comparison. There's always some musician out there who's better. that's wonderful. I appreciate that. It's not jealousy. I'm in awe of other people's talent, and I'm just trying to have fun with the stuff I do.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. So everybody says they're busy. You are truly busy. You're a busy guy. You've founded and you've run several programs. You're co-host of Two Guys in Your Head on KUT. You're always a guest or panelist or speaker somewhere, and you're a huge ally and friend to staff here at UT. You're regularly giving, talks and programs like this. You have an incredible sense of service to this university. And I would say in particular to staff. Staff really admire you. Have you always been this way? How do you keep up with it? How do you manage all those balls in the air at one time?
Yeah, it is sort of funny, actually. If I look back, even in high school, I think the time periods in which I think I did best in all of my classes were the ones where I had the most other stuff going on. I do think there's something about being really busy that is
adrenaline or something.
Yeah, or well, it's very focusing, and so I think that's great. But I just, it's hard. It's hard to say no to things, and it's funny. Karen Carlson, who's one of my colleagues over in psychology, she and I used to complain that neither of us were very good at saying no to stuff, and so we made the joke that we'd have a support group that met every day to teach each other to say no, and that you knew you didn't need the support group anymore when you stopped going and you said, no, I'm not going to do that anymore.
That's great.
But the funny thing was, I found at one point that I did learn to say no to some things, and and then they started asking me to do better things, and so there's always so many cool opportunities, and in particular professionally, UT is such a wonderful institution. It really is, and I think that's true because of our great faculty, because of our great staff, because of the students. And I think, the way that we all rose to the occasion for the pandemic is a great demonstration of that. And I really do feel like, why, I've often asked why would a staff member work at UT? Because it's not for the money.
No.
Right. And it is partly for the mission, but I think it also has to be because we're a community. And because we look out for each other, and because we do things. And I that's something that over the years, I have really found that it's something that I try to take more and more as a personal responsibility. I think, I have benefited so much from the help of all sorts of people here at UT. And I just think it's really important for all of us to feed that back and just feed this community.
Yeah. As you mentioned, you also do some consulting work, and there are a lot of consultants out there who are doing behavioral psych, org learning, but not too many who have the kind of trench experience that you have. So talk to us about that. Do you need to be intentional about practicing what you preach? Are there times when you realize, wow, that is not how it looked on paper? That's not how it works in the books.
Well, it's funny. I mean, one of the things that I love about doing the consulting work and also teaching the master's students in the Human Dimensions of Organizations program and some of our continuing ed students is that you're constantly having to run water through the pipes of all of the recommendations you make about work. I mean, if you make a recommendation to a consultant and it doesn't work, well, then you got to go back and figure out what was missing. And sometimes that actually feeds back on the research. I must admit, one of the things that's done for me is I'm not particularly faddish when it comes to the recommendations I make based on the psych literature. I actually recommend to my colleagues who want to consult and write popular books and things like that to really focus on research that's at least 15 years old when you're making recommendations. Because I think that there's a tendency for somebody to take a fairly new finding, trot it out there because nobody's heard about it before, but then it turns out that it doesn't hold up. It takes about 15 years to really vet this stuff. And so to me, I've always focused on stuff that I'm very confident is correct. And I think that that's been really important. But I will say, I do think it's also affected the way that I work. I mean, I do find myself in the roles that I've taken on, falling back on things that I have learned from the research over the years and using that as part of my leadership strategy, communication strategy, and things like that.
Yeah. Yeah, there's always more to learn. So let's get into talking about complex planning and examining alternatives. So for some researchers or scholars who focus on cognitive science and decision making, getting that 5 o'clock call from the provost on a Saturday, might be more terrifying or intimidating than it was exciting. It's sort of like the dog who caught the car, right? Like, what were you feeling? What was going through your mind when you got that call?
It was exciting. It was an exciting opportunity. I mean, I think, I really clearly the university, it was the biggest challenge that was facing the university, and not just at the time, but probably, in a decade. And it was exciting to think about it because, particularly, putting my human dimensions of organizations hat on. I mean, what better way to really work through a lot of the kinds of things that we teach regularly to the undergrads and the master's students than to really try to take on the kind of problem that, as I tried to characterize it early on, it was complicated enough. We weren't going to make everybody happy. And chances are, in some ways, we were going to make everybody unhappy in some way. And so it was trying to manage expectations, allow people to feel like they were being heard, actually get the best information we could from as wide a group as possible, including understanding what other universities were doing, and then creating a sustainable process that would allow us to adapt to all of the errors we made, as well as just the changes in the world situation and the changes in our knowledge. I mean, all of that was it was a huge challenge, and honestly, yeah, it was exciting to get involved with it, but clearly a little terrifying in the sense that it was very, very much a high stakes sort of thing to do.
Right. It's there's a lot of variables and a lot at stake. Along those lines of the fear that everybody or a lot of people would think that you did it wrong. And there obviously would have been some clear sort of indicators that you did screw up if that happened. But there must have been some level of sort of confirmation bias or desirability bias as well. And did you have to sort of watch out for that and gauge that in some way to say, we got to make sure that we're not going this route or making this decision because this is what we want to happen, or because we don't want to piss somebody off? How did you gauge that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the things, and obviously confirmation bias is a huge issue, right? I think we often try to see the world the way we want to see it. We often try to massage our beliefs about things to conform to the way we hope that they're going to be. There's a kind of motivated reasoning behind that. But I think one of the things that we did that I liked a lot was early on, we decided we were going to stand up these planning scenarios. And so for those of you who were involved in this process at all, for about 8 weeks, we had a weekly planning scenario where we just took ideas that people had put together for all sorts of aspects of how to open the university, whether it was the class schedule, the maximum occupancy of our rooms, the use of masks, hand sanitizer, whatever. I mean, just all sorts of things. And we just put it in a big document. And we said, what if we opened this way? And the idea was not, this is the plan, but rather, what if this was the plan? What's wrong? How is this screwed up? And what was nice about that was there was nobody's name on the planning scenario. So it was nobody's idea. It was everybody's idea. And so it meant that everyone felt free to bash it and to make, and not just to bash it, but to say, well, what if we tried it this way instead? And so we had this great cadence where we'd release that report to the executive committee, sort of the high level leadership and the heads of all the working groups on a Friday. And then on Saturday, it would be sent out to the broader university community. And then all of the people working on this problem, I mean, the sort of hundreds of people across campus, faculty, staff, students who were engaged in this would just savage that that poor planning scenario. And then I would get all that feedback on a Wednesday afternoon, and Thursday morning would basically take the previous week's planning scenario and turn it into the next week's planning scenario based on all that feedback. And we do it again. And we did it for 8 weeks. And, it really helped. There was much less confirmation bias because we were getting this input from so many people with so many different kinds of expertise. And we were finding out what other schools were doing. And all of that, I think, helped us to avoid trying to implement a particular person's vision and instead to settle on something that we thought was a reasonable starting point. And I think that was something we did that was really, really quite successful.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting. I mean, because you certainly want to have somebody who's accountable, which is you in this case, but you're not, pushing the buck. It's just sort of this ability to make sure that people can make mistakes, which sort of, you sort of answered my next question, and also addresses what we were talking about with sort of stumbling through things in a way. But you must have had moments where you had to pivot a completely different direction or find an option to a problem, and that option at the time was just elusive, and you had a short time. Like we have this sense that it was COVID was this slow motion train wreck, but in terms of planning, you had to move very quickly.
Yeah, it was rapid. I mean, luckily for us, one of the first things we did was actually to characterize the key points of the pandemic. And I actually thought, well, it's going to take us weeks to wrap our head around this, and how are we going to do that? And I started talking with all sorts of public health people and epidemiologists and health and wellness folks. And it turned out that within a week, we understood that there were only 4 things we needed to know about the pandemic, which were that from the standpoint of last year, that COVID-19 was going to be here with us for the foreseeable future, that there wasn't going to be a viral cure within 12 months, that there wasn't going to be a vaccine widely distributed within 12 months, and that if social distancing behavior decreased markedly, that people were going to get sick. And it turned out if you knew those 4 things, you knew everything you needed to know about the pandemic to be able to do a lot of the planning. I mean, there were certainly details we had to worry about, like, does it travel in aerosols or just in large droplets, which was stuff that we were learning on the fly. Early on, we thought surfaces mattered a lot. Later, it seemed like surface transmission wasn't such a big deal. So there were things we learned. But yeah, things had to happen really quickly. And and we had to, and particularly because we needed lead time for things like scheduling classes. I mean, the registrar had to completely redo the course schedule, and we had to give the registrar's office as much time as possible to do that. So yeah, it was, it really did, we had the academic working group, which was one of the 6, we had 13 task forces with about 250 people who were working who were generating new reports every week on topics like online education and lab spaces, and how do you, faculty welfare and student welfare and all sorts of other things. And I mean, it was just the amount of, I think we just, drawing from that wider range of people, I think was really helpful, because it meant that we weren't relying on a single person to be brilliant at coming up with every idea.
Yeah. Yeah. So another, last month, on top of COVID, on top of all the other social unrest crisis and everything that we were facing, Texas was hit with yet another crisis having to do with weather. So in terms of complex planning, examining alternatives, what are your thoughts about how things unfolded here first? Because it's weather. We've been able to predict the weather for some time now. So in the planning aspect of that, and so as it approached, and then of course, as it hit us, what are your thoughts about planning and examining alternatives?
Yeah, I think this raises another set of issues, which has to do with how do you value rare outcomes over the long term. So part of the problem we faced in the state was that there is a certain amount of preventative maintenance, winterizing, other things that need to be done to protect the power grid, whatever it is from extreme cold weather. And the problem is that at any given moment, it doesn't necessarily make sense today to do that. But rare events are going to occur over the long term, and they're damaging, expensive, and dangerous when they do occur. And I think, pandemic preparation is another example of that. And I think, we as great as crisis management can be, right? And I think we did a wonderful job of managing the COVID crisis. One of the things we have to ask ourselves exiting this is, are there some things that maybe we should have been prepared to do already? That were more foreseeable. Certainly I think there were things that were foreseeable in the electric grid and other aspects that made this winter storm worse. But should we be devoting some resources at all times to planning for things that don't happen often, but when they do are devastating?
Yeah, there was an interesting episode of Two Guys where you talked about that, and this idea that it's hard to invest in the future in that way, but it's something we do, in practice, and that's something we need to start thinking about more now. And I think you also had an article somewhere that
I think there might have been a Fast Company piece on that.
Fast Company, yeah. I think you're right. Well, this is helpful. Let's our standard closing here. So our first one is, what are you reading currently? And I suspect it's a lot. So just keep it down to something that you're particularly excited about, or that you would recommend.
Yeah, so I got two things I'm in the middle of. I got an audio book that I listen to on the rowing machine, and that's The Power Broker, which is Robert Caro's biography of Robert
That
Moses.
should take you about 2 months to listen to.
It's a 66-hour book on audio, but I'm loving that. And I just picked up Cast, the Isabel Wilkerson's book on caste systems, and that's been fascinating. I can't do much of a summary yet. I'm like 80 pages into it, but enjoying that. I mean, learning a lot so far. Enjoying may be the wrong word, but I'm learning.
It's a tough topic, right? Next question: what was the hardest thing? So I think I might know the answer to this, but let's try. Maybe you can be kind of specific about this aspect. What was the hardest thing you've ever had to do as a leader?
I would say that gosh, I don't know. I'm not. I mean, I think the hardest thing is which I think many leaders find is having to disappoint people, right? I mean, that when you go in one direction rather than another, everyone's not going to be happy. And I think we all like we all like to be able to make people, to satisfy everybody's goals, and learning how to effectively say no to people in a way that still keeps everybody engaged, I think, is probably the hardest thing.
Yeah, John Daly last episode said something very similar to that. Give us two, just to close us out here, give us two key pieces of leadership advice.
Yeah, I think the first thing is spread the credit and take the blame. I think it's really important to recognize that any success you have as a leader is because of all the people who are working for you, and that as a leader, you're going to get way more credit than you deserve for anything you do. So make sure that you acknowledge every contribution everybody's made, but the buck stops here. So as a leader, you also have to accept the criticism and the blame for the things that have gone wrong, and then learn from that. And I think the other thing, gets back to what I was saying earlier, which is be willing to listen. It turns out that there's a lot of smart people out there who have really great ideas, and if you keep your ears open, you can often discover ideas that are way better than anything you came up with by just hearing what people have to say and then giving credit for them.
Mm-hmm. Listen more than you play.
Yeah.
Art, this is amazing talk. I really appreciate you taking the time. I know how busy you are, and you do so much for this community. Thank you so much, everybody. This will be recorded and put up on YouTube. And again, I hope we can work with you again soon. Your contributions are invaluable to the UT community. Thank you, Art.
Thanks, Sam.
Bye-bye.